Louise Goode, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you. I've calmed down a bit now.
Yeah, I bet, after organizing the perhaps the biggest protest against the Watchtower in, I don't know, history maybe. And yeah, I mean, are you coming back down to earth a bit?
Yeah, I am. I knew there'd be a sort of an emotional come down afterwards. Hit me a little bit yesterday.
Yeah.
But actually, it's all been very positive since the protest. There's been lots of sort of like media interest, so it's been nice.
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know, just happens across this, there was a big, I think you got a district convention for Jehovah's Witnesses at the Excel. Is that what it was called?
District. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, my memory.
Circuit. Well, it's a whole gathering of very enthusiastic Jehovah's Witnesses. They do this all the time to preach to themselves, and occasionally you might get protesters, but I don't think anything like this. I think there was. When I was there, it looked like there was at least 100, at least on day one.
There was, day one, 108.
Wow. And there were 4 days altogether because it was 2 weekends, August 11 to 12, and then 18 and 19. And this is something very dear to your heart. You were a Jehovah's Witness and you left.
Yeah.
And you have, like a lot of people who were there protesting, they had very serious issues through things like abuse and harm of all kinds. And really, we just wanted to educate the people, if not the JWs themselves, the general public. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. Yes, that's exactly so, yes.
So I just want to give a shout out to your JW community podcast, and I'll put a link.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much.
And that's very good, because obviously this is one of the debriefs we're doing, but obviously you'll do a lot more on the on the radio show. And speaking of radio shows, you had BBC Hereford and Worcester interviewing you, didn't they?
Yes, we did. Radio. And they had done a story last year about the abuse issue and interviewed somebody. And they found another lady called Sian who gave an absolutely horrific personal experience of her own abuse to them. So they had a fairly extended piece talking to Sian. And Sian's issue, obviously, it wasn't just the abuse. It was the fact that when she reported it to the elders, they covered it up and they told her that she had to obey her dad, who was the person that was emotionally, physically abusing her, and sexually, I think, as well. And so she was afforded no help whatsoever as a child. And that was the issue that we were protesting. Not the fact that bad apples occur in every barrel, but what happens after you report it to the organisation. That was the real issue. So Hereford and Worcester did a really nice story with Sian, and they interviewed me briefly. And then also BBC Radio Gloucestershire picked that up, and so did BBC Radio Stoke as well.
Yeah, and I think today I noticed on the Secularism.org UK they did something, and I believe The Guardian as well. It seems to be quite a hot topic at the moment because of what's going on with the Catholic priests, and of course the 300 predator priests from Pennsylvania, which were just uncovered. And obviously a lot of people think it's just the Catholic Church, but it certainly isn't.
No, it certainly isn't. It's every. I mean, so at the protest, people were coming up to us and saying, "Why are you picking on this organisation? Because it's in every group and organisation." And we were saying, "Well, we know that, but I have limited time. I can only protest one, and you protest what you know, don't you?"
So we're just going to go through what happened. I was there on day one, so I can only speak from day one, although I think all 4 days were very successful. First of all, I just want to ask who really the intended audience was. I think it might have been the public, but it was everybody, really, wasn't it?
It was mixed. So for me personally, and I wasn't dictating my agenda to other people that came, but for me personally, the audience was the wider public. I feel like the 80-20 rule, that if you're going to get bogged down in arguing with individual witnesses, it's 80% of the effort for 20% of the payoff. It's very small beer doing one-on-one arguments. And I genuinely believe there's so much information out there that Jehovah's Witnesses will wake up when they're ready, like we all did. We all woke up when we were ready and the information's there. So for me, the audience was the wider public and the media attention that we'd get and the newspaper attention. We were also reported in the Daily Mail in Hull as well. So that was a nice article that a lady got going. But for other people who came along, they had a different agenda, and I was happy for everyone to pursue their own agendas because, you know, I felt that it wasn't about controlling people's voices again. The Watchtower have controlled people's voices for years, and therefore for me, I wasn't going to start controlling people's voices again and telling them what they were allowed to say, who they were allowed to talk to, what they were allowed to do beyond the law that was stipulated to us by security. So for people who went, they did want to speak to the witnesses, and indeed the witnesses wanted to speak to us, and so it was brilliant that there were people there willing to engage with anyone who came up and spoke to us.
Yeah, and that's something I witnessed quite a bit when I was there, is that when they came out for lunch, a lot of the JWs, they looked over at where the protest was, and we were behind kind of a barrier. And some of them looked very confused. Others are like, oh, let's go and sort of scoff at them. But there were those who came up right to the barrier and right in front of these banners saying, you know, the Jehovah's Witness organization hides pedophiles, and discussed it.
And engage.
And thankfully the protesters, they weren't yelling at them, they weren't, you know, trying to hang them or anything. It was just a case of dialogue going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that continued on all 4 days. And I would say it seemed to happen even more so the second weekend, although it was a different cohort of witnesses. So I think altogether there were 30,000 witnesses attended over the 2 weekends. But the first weekend it was one group and the second weekend it was another. One of the interesting things was that there were 2 security guards who supported us. One was the senior security officer and another one was a lady called Becky. And Becky they were both amazing. But Becky grew to support us more and more over the 2 weekends. And by the second weekend, when people came up to us and said, why are you picking out this group out of all of them? Becky would step in before we had a chance to say anything and say, they're allowed to protest who they like. They've got, you know, an institutional right to protest. And she was defending for us before the people had even got to us. So that was incredible to have that kind of support from people who weren't even, like, you know, were supposed to be independent.
So, but that wasn't the only surprise or story that you took away of things which you never would have guessed would have happened.
Absolutely.
Can you think of any other interesting surprises and stories, the things that you've taken away from
Definitely. So one of the things that I found that people online between the 2 protests were saying, what is the point of doing this? They're not going to look at you. They're not going to engage, because that's how we were when we were in. But I was in 20 years ago. So times have changed, and I genuinely did not know that. I didn't know that it had changed. And I would have said the same. I would have agreed with the critics. In fact, I was nervous because I was agreeing with the critics and saying, yeah, you're right. What is the point? But people were coming up to us and speaking. One lady came up and said, I'm here with my family, my 3 sons. Tomorrow's my last day. I'm not coming back. Another couple. So at the end of the day, we'd all go over to the Fox pub, which was right on site, and so would all the witnesses. So it was rammed with witnesses and protesters, and we all know who each other was. It was obvious. It was like the battle lines at World War I. We all knew who we were, and we were sat outside.
They're dressed up and wearing the badges and everything as well.
Badges,
so you could tell the JWs.
Yeah, that's right. So one lady came up to me and she kissed me, and I said, and she had a badge on. And I said, oh, thank you very much. I was a bit nervous for her. And I said, well, have a nice evening. And then her husband came up and he said to me, she's got Alzheimer's. She kisses everyone. And I said, oh, I'm really sorry. My nana has Alzheimer's. But then he stopped to talk to us for ages, and he had his badge on. This was an old couple. And then he was saying to us, oh, brilliant work. Well done. Keep it up. And I thought, what world am I living in? Does he know who we are? He absolutely knew who we were. We had a young man come up on the first weekend who'd said, I was trying to get reinstated to get my family back, and he said, "You've just reminded me. Thank you for reminding me." And he turned and walked off.
Yes, I heard that from Stefan, I think it was. That's amazing.
I mean, with everybody, every single person that was protesting had an experience like that. So for me, that wasn't the purpose, but it was an amazing unintended consequence that happened. We also got a lot of private messages, and I've seen a message on Reddit today of somebody who said he's woken up, but he's still going along because his wife is a witness and hasn't. He said, "Thank you for being there, because our presence made it bearable for him." And he said also it enabled him to open a dialogue with his wife, because she looked at one of our banners that said Watchtower protects paedophiles and shuns victims, and she said that's nonsense. And then he was able to show her the stuff from the Royal Commission, and he said that helped him open a non-confrontational dialogue with his wife. So he was like, "Thank you very much for being there. Thank you for making it bearable." Obviously, he wasn't able to come up and speak to us or anything, but I think there were a lot of people there, and we got private messages as well, that were grateful just for our presence, just to reassure them that they weren't on their own.
Wow, it's amazing. I also heard one story that somebody came up to, didn't even know what was going on there, and he saw the sign, Watchtower protects pedophiles, and all he saw was protect pedophiles.
Yeah.
What is this? And they explained, and he said, "Well, actually, my job is to root out pedophile rings, that sort of thing." I think that he calls himself a shadow hunter or something like that.
Yeah, I know.
And he said, "Oh, I didn't realize this organization, it was so rife." I'm surprised he didn't really.
Yeah.
But he's gone off and is looking into that.
Yeah.
Could be big.
It was amazing. There was one lady came up to us, and an attendant came and kind of put his arm around her and said, "Sister, can I move you away?" And she turned to him and said, "I'll speak to who I like, thank you very much." And we all thought, "Oh, love, oh God, no, you'll get disfellowshipped." Like, I felt protective for them, because we recognise what danger they're in by showing an interest. But I genuinely think the fear has gone. I think where people have traditionally said, don't protest, you're only feeding into their, fear of apostates and negative view of apostates. Overall, although there were a few people that were angry and shouting, overall, it didn't feel like fear. They were all looking. They were swarming past looking. Lots of them were taking photographs or selfies with us behind.
Yeah,
Some of
got
them
a lot of footage of that.
Yeah, yes. Some of them were walking down the barrier, videoing it as they walked down.
Yeah, that was weird.
Yeah, that was weird. And somebody said, "Well, are they just taking the photographs so they can get your faces so they know to avoid you?" I don't care why they're doing it. Do it. I don't care why they're doing it, because it's all good publicity.
That's true. And you know what you say about there's this debate that's been, I guess, raging on amongst ex-JWs for a couple of years now about activism and this criticism of aggressive activism.
Yeah, I traditionally agreed with you, don't be aggressive. I genuinely, honestly believe this was not aggressive activism. It really wasn't. It was.
Do you think that this protest has gone a long way to putting that debate to bed?
I genuinely think this protest has gone a long way to putting that debate to bed, because the word protest is frightening. It's not as frightening to people who aren't witnesses, because, teachers traditionally, that's part of their voice is to protest, and other organisations, part of their voice is to protest. But for witnesses or ex-witnesses, it sounds more aggressive than it is. And then we've had examples of, there's this word crashing, which again, I don't like the word, because nobody bumps into anything, nothing gets knocked over, nobody gets hit. It's not crashing, it's going up and engaging in dialogue with someone until the point where you're asked to stop. So the words sound worse than they are, but I think genuinely this was so peaceful. It was so good-natured. The witnesses were good-natured. We were good-natured, and by and large, they were good-natured. And then there was this bizarre dialogue between us in the pub where we were smiling and looking and talking, and it was, you had to be there to see how amazing it was, really.
Oh, this is something that a lot of good is going to come out of this. It already is, which is amazing.
Yeah.
But saying that, is there anything, now that you've organized this, your first protest, anything in hindsight that you would do differently, that you would, as advice to people who perhaps want to put their own protest on
Yeah.
JWs or a similar cult?
Yeah, there is a few things I'd do differently. So before I talk about that, one of the things that I would say is one of the unintended consequences that I hadn't realised would happen was the absolute epiphany that it meant for the people who came along to the protest. Lots of people were nervous about coming, or were thinking, oh, it's going to be aggressive or it's going to be confrontational, and I don't want that. The people who came along were blown away by their own emotional journey and how calm and happy they felt. And lots of people have had a seismic turnaround in their own emotions. And so I would say, next time I would definitely advertise that as an intended consequence, that if you come along, you will find some positive movement in your own emotions. You'll get rid of some of your latent fears, not by shouting at them, not even by saying it, just by coming and standing. Some people just came and stood. I personally wasn't able to engage with witnesses because that's not my skill set, because it upsets me too much. So I just stood and watched, but other people were able to. So one of the things I'd do differently is, because I was so nervous about the situation, about it being on private land, and I knew that witnesses knew we were coming, and I knew that they were working with Excel, so I didn't engage with Excel because I thought they're never gonna, if I ask them, can we come, that's the first, they'll say no, and then the whole thing's dead in the water. So I thought, just rock up. Now, as it happened, I didn't realise Excel are incredibly amenable to supporting protests, even though they don't have to be legally. So one of the things Becky said to us when she was escorting me to the car was, we fought for your right to protest. This is your democratic right. You're entitled to do this, and we will support that. And we support all sorts of protests, actually.
So there've been other protests there then, obviously.
Oh yeah, so I was in contact with another protester for a completely different issue. When they have arms fairs at Excel, there are protesters, and that was my model why I thought we could protest there, because I'd already seen that online. So I was in contact with him, and he was giving me advice. But Becky was like, oh no, we see all sorts here. We support everybody's democratic right to protest. And I said, well, actually, Becky, we don't have a democratic right on private land, but thank you very much. So what I'd do in the future is I would contact them in advance, because they were so helpful. They set up the barriers, they gave us a space. They said, if there's more of you come, we'll make that space bigger. They were amazing. They were utterly amazing. They helped us by taking away witnesses that were shouting at us. And they were really,
wow.
Yeah. And they'd do it if we asked. So one of the protesters, somebody was being quite nasty to an abuse victim and saying, A, it was a lie, and then B, when she had the newspaper article, he said, well, how long ago was that? 25 years ago. Why can't you get over it? So one of our protesters went to security and said, can you remove this person, please? Someone's going to get up. And they did. And then another guy came along and he was shouting for a bit, got somebody upset, and they moved him on. If there was any issues, I was sat in the pub the last weekend in the afternoon, and there was an issue on site. The security man, instead of going in heavy-handed and telling people what to do, he went and fetched me from the pub and said, can you just come and have a word with this person and sort it out. He was absolutely amazing. So one thing I'd change is I'd engage on that particular venue with the security, because they were incredible. Another thing I'd change is I would encourage people to come for their own personal journey, irrespective of the witness audience or the greater public audience. People were moved in their own phobias and fears towards witnesses, and a lot of people felt, well, some people said they had like an epiphany. I did personally. The other thing I would do is I would never leave one person on their own. So I'd always leave 2 or more people on their own in a group together. So where we were going off in between protests to the pub, I would make sure, because I made a little bit of a mistake there, and I didn't realise there was a girl kind of manning the fort on her, and she wasn't even an ex-witness, and somebody was quite nasty to her and she got upset, and I felt I felt personally responsible for that as the organizer, that she'd got upset. So I'd learn from that. I'd leave a group. And then the other thing that Karen Morgan said, who's an abuse victim herself, she said, we've missed a trick by not being here when the sessions are on, because we thought there's no witnesses around. What's the point of being here? But she stayed with her family on the Sunday between when the sessions were on, while we all went to the pub for our lunch.
And when you say sessions, what do you mean by that?
So when the Jehovah's Witness convention was happening and they were all back inside and seated and listening to the talks, so there were none of them wandering around, we thought, well, there's no point being here. We just stuck around at lunchtime, their lunchtime when they were out, and their tea time when they were out of the seats and walking around.
Yeah.
But Karen said, when they're all seated, there are a few people who want to come out quietly and talk to us. And we missed that trick, that they were able to come out while everyone else, the majority of the other witnesses, were seated and listening to the talks. She said quite a few people came out and wanted to have quiet discussions without being in the public eye. So that's something I'd change in the future. I'd have the protest manned at some level for the whole day, really.
Thank you so much for what you did, and it came off brilliantly, I think, and I think a lot of good is coming out of this, and it was brilliantly organized, and I can't believe you've never organized anything before. But
No, I know.
certainly not to this scale, but I mean, if somebody's watching and thinking, you know, I live the other side of the world, I'm really inspired by what went on in London, but I would like to do this, I don't know where to start, what sort of advice would you give them? What sort of little list of bullet points would you give them right now?
We had a Facebook page called JW Protest, which was just primarily for advertising this one, but because we had so many people say they wanted to organise protests, we're going to use that page as a resource to give people ideas and help and support and to advertise. One of the things I would say is to advertise it a lot, start early. So we started 8 months before this, and we still only got 100 people, right? It's very hard to get engagement. Once they'd seen that first weekend, I think people realised that it was going to be okay. It wasn't going to be aggressive or shouty or upsetting. And I think a lot more people wanted to come, but of course there was only a few days then to plan. So I think don't be scared about coming along now. But stay together, I would say, is a good thing to do, because I do feel that if we'd have been spread out, those where witnesses were shouting, there might have been little arguments kicking off all over, but where we were together, we were able to support each other. We were able to have a change of face, so that if one person was getting upset, somebody else could just swap in and be calm, and that was a powerful thing to do. And I'd say be clear about the behaviour that you expect. You can't dictate to people what they're going to do, but you can be clear about what you want for your protest. I think if you over dictate, you lose people. They've had the voice controlled. They don't want controlling, so I get that. But people do need to understand that their individual behaviour will affect the group. They do need to understand that they on their own could ruin the whole thing for everybody. For instance, one witness shouting at us made us say, oh, they're really aggressive, aren't they? But actually there were 29,995 witnesses that weren't aggressive. But the 5 that did scream abuse made you think, oh, aren't they horrible and aggressive? So it cuts the other way. If you have one protester shouting, they're going to think, oh, they're all aggressive. So I'd say be clear about the behaviour, research whether it's private or public land, and go for it. Don't go online and say, is anyone organising a protest in my area? Go online and say, I would like to organise a protest in my area, and come onto the JW Protest page and get some ideas and support.
Because it's definitely worth it, isn't it?
It's definitely worth it. Definitely. And if nothing else, it gave, I think, hundreds and hundreds of witnesses who are physically in but mentally out. It gave them heart. They couldn't come up and speak to us because of the families, but they were so, I genuinely know they were so grateful for just having us stood there and making them feel less alone.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, all I've got to say is thank you so much for talking to us and Talk Beliefs again. And if you hold another one of these protests, I don't know, next year, probably not at the Excel, I suppose, would be at somewhere else.
Yeah, I agree. I want to do Cardiff next year.
All right. Okay. We can cover that. And if I don't get down there, at least I can perhaps do another interview with you just to see how things went, how things changed, any surprises, and also, is anyone, as you say, wake up, which means, you know, coming out of the cult mentality.
And can I just thank you as well, Mark, for supporting us. I was blown away by the support from people who've never been Jehovah's Witnesses. And I just think that is so phenomenally kind and generous. And all the support you've given in doing your podcast afterwards is really, really kind. Thank you so much. Well,
that's no problem at all. And hopefully, yeah, as I say, we'll get together again soon, and we'll hear some more incredible stories. So, Louise Goode, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.